A woman in a charcoal suit stood up at the corner table of the Magnolia Room in Charleston. The card reader blinked red for the third time. The manager raised his voice, slow, deliberate, loud enough to carry across the dining room. Every fork paused. She set her napkin down without looking up. "I can't afford this meal," she said quietly, and walked out, leaving an untouched plate behind her. In the back kitchen, a man in a faded flannel shirt stopped wiping a glass. He had seen the card decline. He had also seen what came 2 seconds before it. The man in the back of that kitchen, the one no one in the room bothered to look at, was the only person in Charleston that night who could read what the receipt was actually hiding. A CEO walks out of a restaurant with that single sentence on her lips. What do you think was really happening behind that declined card? Daniel Mercer woke before the sun. The small cedar house at the edge of West Ashley still smelled faintly of last night's rain. He moved through the kitchen the way he moved through everything quietly, with the long, easy economy of a man who had stopped wasting motion years ago. The coffee maker ticked. The toaster gave a soft pop. He cut 2 slices of sourdough into the shape of stars, the way he always did on Thursdays, and slid them onto a pale blue plate. "Daddy." Hazel padded into the kitchen barefoot, her hair a halo of sleep. She climbed onto the chair across from him and pulled her sketchbook open without asking, the way she did most mornings. A new bird sat half-finished on the page, a robin with a chest like a small red ember. "You came home late," she said without looking up. "A guest forgot something," Daniel said. "I waited to see if she'd come back for it." "Did she?" "Not yet." Hazel nodded, the way 8-year-olds nod when they accept an answer that isn't quite an answer, and went back to her bird. He watched her draw for a long minute before he finished his coffee. He drove her to school in a Ford that had passed 200,000 miles years ago. At the curb, he leaned across the seat and pressed a kiss to the top of her head and told her he would be there at 3. She waved without turning around, already running toward the swings. By noon, Daniel was on his back beneath an industrial ice maker at the Magnolia Room, a wrench balanced on his sternum, listening to the compressor cycle the way other men listened to their own children's breathing. He knew this restaurant the way a doctor knew a patient. He knew which line on the breaker box ran hot in summer, which floor tile lifted in the rain, which freezer door needed a quarter turn extra on the handle. He had worked here for almost 3 years. The staff thought of him as the quiet handyman who fixed things and went home. Nothing more. 27 floors above downtown Charleston, Adrienne Vale was learning that her own card had been frozen. She stood in her glass office at Vale Holdings, with the phone pressed against her ear, listening to a man at her bank explain, in the calm, distant voice banks reserved for the rich, that the freeze had originated internally. Not from fraud, not from balance, from a request inside her own company, signed off through corporate governance the previous evening at 7:42. She set the phone down. Her hands were perfectly steady, which is what hands do when the rest of a person has stopped breathing. Renata Ahn, her assistant of 9 years, stepped into the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and saw her face and did not speak. "Find out who signed it," Adrienne said. "I'm trying." "Try harder." Outside the glass, the office moved on. Phones rang. Spreadsheets opened. Nobody looked at her directly. She had felt this kind of silence before, only once, on the morning her father had died, when the entire building had pretended she could not see them watching. She turned back to the window and looked at the harbor and tried to remember what she had said the night before, walking out of that restaurant. The words came back to her exactly. She had said them out loud, and the city had heard her, and the city would not forget for a while. The boardroom of Vale Holdings sat on the 28th floor, one above the executive suite, and it had the kind of view that made directors forget how much they were being paid. By 10 o'clock that morning, 12 of them were seated around the long walnut table. Adrienne stood at the head and presented her plan for the new resort property at Sullivan's Island. 60 rooms, low-impact construction, 4 years to break even. She had built the deck herself. Her voice did not waver. Preston Marlowe waited until she sat down before he opened his binder. He was 46, silver at the temples, and carried himself like a man who had been told too many times that he was indispensable. He produced a financial summary. None of them had seen a 5-page document with numbers slightly off from the ones Adrienne had been working with for months. He spoke about cash flow concerns. He spoke about the optics of the previous evening. 2 of the directors, The same two who always traded glances first, traded glances now. A man at the far end cleared his throat. There was video, he said, not unkindly. Yes, Preston answered. There was. He proposed, with a face perfectly arranged for regret, that financial decision-making be temporarily consolidated under his office for 90 days, until the noise died down. Adrian argued. She was articulate, controlled, surgical. She lost the room anyway. The vote was not taken. Preston was too careful for that. But she could feel the count even before it would have been called. After the meeting, the directors filed out one by one. 2 of them did not meet her eyes. Adrian stayed in the boardroom alone for 10 minutes after the last man had gone. The view from the 28th floor was the same one her father had liked best. The harbor, the bridges, the rooftops of the historic district running south toward the water. He had told her, on the last good afternoon of his life, that the building did not belong to her until she could lose it and still come back the next morning. She had not understood him then. She understood him now. She gathered her papers carefully and walked downstairs to a desk that was no longer hers. That afternoon, at the Magnolia Room, Coleman Briggs stood behind the polished bar with his elbows on the wood and laughed at his own joke. 2 younger waiters laughed with him, the way young waiters laugh at their manager. An expensive lesson, Coleman said, was taught last night to the right person. You'll see. By the end of the week, that woman won't be running anything but errands. Behind the bar, on the other side of the wall, Daniel Mercer was on a ladder replacing a thermostat. His hand stopped moving for a single beat. He set the screwdriver down very carefully, finished the wiring, climbed down, and went back to the kitchen without speaking. By 5 o'clock, Adrian Vale had made a decision. She would not give anyone in this city the satisfaction of an unpaid bill. She slid a thick envelope into her coat pocket and called for the car. The Magnolia Room was 3/4 full when Adrian Vale pushed through the heavy oak door at 6:15. The early dinner crowd had just settled in couples on second dates, a table of bankers in shirt sleeves, a long table near the window that looked like a corporate celebration. She did not look at any of them. She crossed the dining room in a straight line, the way she had crossed boardrooms her entire adult life, and stopped in front of the host's stand where Coleman Briggs was already waiting for her. He had seen her come in through the front window. He had taken his time arranging his face. "Miss Vale," he said, just loud enough. She placed the envelope on the polished wood between them. "Last night's bill," she said, "plus gratuity, in cash." Coleman did not pick it up. Instead, he opened the flap with one finger, looked inside, and let out a small whistle of false admiration that the nearest 4 tables could hear without trying. "Cash," he said. "Well, that's a relief, isn't it? Saves us all another scene." A fork clinked against a plate at the table behind her. Someone at the bar turned on his stool. "I was hoping," Coleman went on, voice climbing a careful half-step, "that you might consider calling ahead next time, Miss Vale, so we can make sure the kitchen is, prepared for the order. We do appreciate the business, of course, but we do also have a certain standard of clientele to think about." 2 phones came up at the corporate table. Adrian did not flinch. She did not blink. She had stood through worse rooms in her life, fundraiser rooms, hostile rooms, rooms full of men who had told her father she would never run anything when he was gone. But none of those rooms had recorded her. A man in an expensive vest at the bar leaned toward his companion and said audibly, "Vale Holdings. I heard their stock is about to crater." Adrian's jaw moved once. "Will there be anything else?" Coleman asked with a smile cut from glass. "No." "Then enjoy your evening, Miss Vale." She turned to go. The shortest line back to the front door cut through the center of the dining room, through the rows of phones, through the celebration table, through the man at the bar. She squared her shoulders to walk it. Behind the dessert station, a door swung open. Daniel Mercer stepped out of the kitchen with a folded white cloth over one arm. He did not look at Coleman. He did not look at the bar. He walked the length of the back wall, past the wine cellar door, past the restrooms, past the staff hallway, until he reached a small unmarked door at the very rear of the dining room that staff used for deliveries. He turned the handle. He held the door open. He looked at Adrian. He did not say a word. She understood in the space of half a breath. She changed her line. She walked the back wall instead of the center of the room, past the wine cellar door, past the restrooms, past the staff hallway, and through the small, unmarked door that Daniel Mercer was holding open for her. He nodded once. She passed him without looking at his face. The door closed behind her with the soft hush of a thing that had been oiled by someone who cared about hinges. Inside the Magnolia room, the phones turned away from where she had been. Outside on the loading dock, Adrian stood in the alley alone for almost a full minute before she remembered how to breathe. Long after the last car had pulled out of the lot that night, Daniel sat alone at the point-of-sale terminal with his phone laid flat beside the keyboard. He did not log in under his own credentials. He did not need to. He had watched Coleman type the manager passcode 3 weeks ago, when the older man had forgotten his reading glasses. He pulled the transaction history for the previous evening and scrolled to the timestamp he wanted, 7:38 in the evening. There it was, a standard card pre-authorization, a decline, a second decline, a third. The codes the system returned were not the codes a normal decline returned. They were soft holds, system side, with an internal flag code that no consumer-facing decline ever produced. To anyone but a man who had spent 15 years reading machine codes for a living, the difference was invisible. To Daniel, it was as loud as a fire alarm. He photographed each screen carefully. He photographed the metadata. He photographed the source field, which named in a string of letters and numbers most managers would never decode a corporate governance portal, accessible only from inside the cardholder's own company. Then he closed every window, cleared the cache, wiped the keyboard with the cloth he carried, and walked out the back door. The next afternoon, Hazel came home from school with a folder of new drawings. She spread them across the kitchen table while Daniel cut apples. There were 2 robins, a sketch of her teacher's dog, a careful study of an oak leaf, and 1 drawing she set apart from the others, the way she always set apart drawings she had thought about. A man stood in the center of the page in a plain shirt. Beside him stood a woman in a gray dress with her hands folded in front of her. The woman was not smiling. The woman looked, Hazel had decided, like she had been crying a long time before, but had stopped. "Who is the lady, Hazelnut?" Hazel shrugged. "I saw her in my head. She looked sad." Daniel looked at the drawing a long time before he set the apples down. That same afternoon, on the 27th floor of Vale Holdings, Renata Ahn carried a thin manila envelope into Adrian's office and closed the door behind her. "This was at the front desk," she said. "No name, no courier slip. Security ran it for everything they have." Adrian opened it. Inside was a single sheet of receipt paper, printed from a point-of-sale terminal. It showed the transaction history of her card from the previous evening, every code, every timestamp, every flag. At the bottom, written in small, even handwriting that did not slant or rush, was 1 line. "Your card wasn't declined because it ran out. It was declined because someone didn't want it to clear." Adrian read the line 3 times. She read it a 4th. "Renata," she said, "who has access to corporate governance overrides. 3 people. You, the chief financial officer, and Preston. Pull the access log for the night of the 14th. I'll need approval from Bullet." Renata nodded once and left. Adrian stood at the window with the receipt in her hand for a long time. The harbor was a flat sheet of silver. The skyline of Charleston stood up around it like a row of teeth. She thought about the man who had opened the back door of the restaurant for her. She thought about the way he had not asked her anything. She thought about the handwriting on the bottom of the receipt, small, even, unhurried, the handwriting of a man who was not in any hurry to be found. She picked up her coat. By Monday morning, the trap had begun to close from 3 sides at once. Adrian arrived at the building to find her office sealed with a printed notice from corporate compliance, citing an internal audit. Preston had filed it Friday evening, after hours, claiming the board had authorized a routine review of executive records. The board had authorized no such thing. 2 directors had simply not answered their phones when he had called. The Post and Courier ran the story by 10. Vale Holdings chief executive refused at Charleston restaurant shares tumble 7% in pre-market. A grainy video, taken from a phone at the corporate celebration table, played on a loop on 3 local stations and 1 regional cable channel. In it, a woman in a charcoal suit stood very still while a manager smiled and spoke. The captions did not include what the manager had said. They did not need to. By noon, Halberd Capital, a private equity firm out of Atlanta, issued a press release announcing its interest in acquiring Vale Holdings at a stabilization premium a price 17% below the company's value 6 weeks earlier. Preston Marlowe, in the same statement, said with practiced reluctance that the board owed it to the shareholders to consider every option. Adrian sat in a conference room she had borrowed from another department, because her own was sealed, and watched the share price slide on a single laptop screen. It was not a financial crisis. It was choreography. She understood that now. She picked up the phone and called Renata. "Find me the man from the restaurant," she said. "The one who opened the back door." "Adrian, you can't possibly find him." That same evening, at the Cedar House in West Ashley, Daniel Mercer was making spaghetti. Hazel sat at the kitchen table with her homework spread out in front of her, a worksheet of multiplication, a library book about constellations, and the sketchbook open to a fresh page. The smell of garlic and basil filled the room. The radio played soft and low. A slow piano piece Hazel had once said sounded like rain that knew where it was going. "Daddy," she said, "what's the bravest bird?" He thought about it while he stirred the pot. "Probably the robin," he said. "The robin doesn't wait for the storm to be over. He flies in it, he flies through it." She wrote that down in the corner of her sketchbook in a careful 8-year-old hand. She drew a tiny robin beside it, wings tilted into the wind. After dinner, he tucked her in and sat on the edge of her bed and read her 2 pages of the constellation book. She fell asleep with one hand curled around the corner of his sleeve, the way she always did. He stayed there a long time, watching her breathe, before he turned off the light. In the front room, on the kitchen table, the printed envelope addressed to Vale Holdings sat where he had left it. He had mailed it from the corner box that morning. He had taken nothing else from the restaurant, but the news on his phone had not stopped scrolling all day. The video, the press release, the 7%, the 17%, the word stabilization, repeated by men in tailored suits on television, the way men in tailored suits had said the word policy 4 years ago when his wife had still been alive. He stood very still in the dark living room. Then, he walked to the closet in the back hall and pulled down a garment bag he had not opened in 4 years. Inside was a charcoal suit, a pressed white shirt, a pair of polished black shoes wrapped in tissue paper. He laid them out on the kitchen table the way other men laid out tools. In the morning, he drove Hazel to school in the Ford, kissed the top of her head, and then drove downtown to the tower with the harbor view. He did not get past the lobby on his first try. The security desk looked at him flannel shirt, traded for a suit that hung a half-size loose on a frame that had not worn it in years, and asked for an appointment. He had none. He asked for Renata on by name. They told him to wait. He waited. He had been waiting almost an hour, when Renata Ahn came down to the lobby on her way back from a meeting, glanced toward the visitor chairs out of habit, and stopped. She recognized the line of his shoulders before she recognized his face. She crossed the marble floor without slowing down. "You're the man from the restaurant." "I am." "What's your name?" "Danielle." "Daniel what?" "Mercer." She studied him a long second. Then she said, "Come with me." They put him in a small interior conference room with no view, the kind of room companies kept for conversations they were not sure they wanted to have. Adrian walked in 2 minutes later with the manila envelope under her arm. She closed the door behind her. She did not sit down. Daniel did not stand up. He laid 3 things on the table between them. The first was a printout of the soft-hold codes from the point-of-sale terminal, annotated in a thin pencil hand. The second was a sheet of plain paper on which he had hand-drawn the timeline of her transaction the moment her card had touched the reader, the moment the freeze had originated inside her own company, the 3-minute window between them. The third was a blank envelope with a Charleston postmark dated 3 weeks before her dinner at the Magnolia Room. Inside, when she opened it, was a single page from a Halberd Capital internal newsletter, listing senior advisors. A name was circled in pencil. The name was Preston Marlowe. Adrian sat down slowly. "Where did you get this?" she said. "The newsletter was mailed to a former colleague of mine," Daniel said. "He thought I might be interested." He was right. "And the rest?" "The point-of-sale terminal at the Magnolia Room. I work there. I fix the equipment." She looked at him for a long time. "Who are you, Mr. Mercer?" "A man who fixes equipment," he said. "But I used to do something else." "What did you used to do?" He did not answer that. Instead, he said, "I'm asking for 2 days. A clean laptop, not connected to anything in this building's network. Access to your last 3 years of vendor contracts and corporate governance logs. A quiet room. no one in this office knowing my name, and in exchange, I tell you who is buying your company. And I give it to you in a form you can hand to a federal investigator. For how much? Nothing. She tilted her head. I'm not selling anything, Miss Vale, Daniel said. I just need my daughter to sleep through the night. She held his eyes a long moment. Then she stood up and walked out without a word. 20 minutes later, Renata Ahn appeared at the door of the small conference room with a closed laptop, a lanyard with no name on it, and a key card to a sixth-floor records room nobody used anymore. She said yes, Renata said. I figured. Mr. Mercer, your daughter. Does she have somewhere to go after school? Daniel looked at her. I can take her to my sister's tonight if it helps, Renata said. My sister has 2 girls about her age. They have a pool. He hesitated. It would help, he said. Thank you. He worked 36 hours without sleep. He did not order coffee. He drank water. He did not eat at the desk. When he needed to think, he stood up and walked the perimeter of the small records room with one hand pressed flat against the wall. By the morning of the second day, he had found everything. Renata Ahn had been at Vale Holdings long enough to know where the old paper lived. She did not search the internet. She searched the archive, the bound volumes of trade press that her predecessor had kept on a shelf in a storage closet on the 14th floor, because nobody had asked her to throw them out. She pulled down a binder from the spring of 2014 and laid it open on the floor. There he was, on page 11 of the second issue, a photograph, slightly grainy, of a younger man with shorter hair and a slightly thinner face, standing in front of a courthouse in Atlanta. The headline above the photograph said Mercer Forensic Group dismantles $3 billion accounting fraud at logistics giant. The article called him one of the most quietly respected forensic accountants of his generation, and the man Fortune 500 firms call when they don't want anyone to know they're calling anyone. Renata closed the binder. She carried it upstairs. She handed it to Adrian without a word and waited. Adrian looked at the photograph for a long time. She did not speak. She did not need to. She turned and walked down the hall to the records room on the 6th floor. Daniel was at the desk, 3 laptops open in a half-arc around him, a stack of printouts to his left, and a small drawing of a robin to his right. He had not slept in a day and a half. He looked oddly, no worse for it than he had 2 days before. She set the binder down on the desk on top of his work. You're Daniel Mercer, she said, of Mercer Forensic Group. He glanced down at the binder. He glanced back up. I was. Your firm broke the Atherton case, and the Hollifield case, and the Beecham case. You were on the cover of a magazine in 2015. I was. Why are you fixing freezers in Charleston? He was quiet for a long moment. My wife was sick, he said, 4 years ago. She had a treatment plan her doctors agreed on, and an insurance company that wouldn't authorize it. There was a clerical error in the prior authorization system, they said. A system error. They were very sorry. They were sure it would be resolved in 7 to 10 business days. He did not look at the binder. He looked at the drawing of the robin. It took 11 days, he said. She didn't have 11 days. The room was very quiet. I closed the firm 3 weeks after the funeral, Daniel said. I sold the building. I moved Hazel to Charleston, where her grandmother used to live. I took work that ended at 5 o'clock so I could be home for dinner. That was the trade. And now? Now I've seen the same kind of system error twice in a week, Daniel said. On a card reader at a restaurant, and on the access log of your governance portal. They are not errors. They never were. For the first time since the night at the restaurant, Adrian Vale wept. She did not turn away. She did not apologize. A single line of water ran down the side of her face and she let it run. I'm sorry about your wife, she said. Thank you, Mr. Mercer. The insurance company. Was it? It was acquired by a holding firm in 2021, he said. Restructured, renamed. The senior staff moved on. One of them, he said, and his voice was the calmest thing in the room, is now a senior advisor at a private equity firm headquartered in Atlanta. She looked at him. Halberd Capital, she said. Yes. She sat down across from him very slowly. The chair received her the way chairs receive people who have just been told the truth. How long until you can put this in front of my board? She asked. He looked at the clock on the wall. 5 hours. The emergency board meeting was called for 2 o'clock that afternoon. It was the kind of meeting nobody had wanted, and everybody had been preparing for. The directors filed in slowly. 2 of them had taken their seats already by the time Preston Marlowe arrived, a leather folio under his arm, and a quiet, almost regretful expression carefully set across his face. On the wall, a video conference panel was lit. The logo of Halberd Capital glowed in the corner of the screen. 3 executives sat at a long table on the other side, hands folded, ready. Adrian entered last. She did not bring a folio. She did not bring a deck. She walked to the head of the table, set her phone face down, and sat. The chair of the board cleared his throat. "Miss Vale, we've called this meeting in light of, recent developments. Mr. Marlowe has indicated that he intends to put a motion to the floor regarding the Halberd offer. Before we proceed, I'd like to yield my opening remarks," Adrian said, "to an independent advisor I've retained." Preston's face moved through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. None of them stayed. "With respect," he said, "any independent advisor would need to have been disclosed to this body in advance." "He was retained as of yesterday morning," Adrian said. "I am disclosing him now." She nodded once. The door at the back of the boardroom opened. Daniel Mercer walked in. He wore the same charcoal suit. He carried 3 stacked folders. He did not look at the directors. He did not look at the screen. He set the folders down at the foot of the long table, not at the head, not in the center, but at the foot, where a man who was not asking for power chose to stand. He looked up. Preston laughed. It was a small, tight laugh, and it died before it reached the walls. "This is your independent advisor," he said. "Forgive me. He looks like a tradesman." "He is," Adrian said. "Among other things." Daniel did not respond to Preston. He addressed the chair of the board. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to distribute 3 documents." The chair, after a glance at Adrian, nodded. Daniel set the first folder in the center of the table. "This," he said, "is the access log for the corporate governance portal of Vale Holdings on the evening of the 14th. At 7:39, an internal freeze request was filed against the company card belonging to Miss Vale. The request was signed off through an administrator account. The administrator account in question has been logged into 6 times in the last 90 days. 5 of those logins came from outside this building. 5 of those external logins originated from a single IP address." He set the second folder beside the first. "This is a record of that IP address. It belongs to a holding company. The holding company is wholly owned by Halberd Capital." He set the third folder beside the second. "And this," he said, "is the email correspondence between that holding company and the personal account of Mr. Preston Marlowe for the last 6 months. The emails were stored on a corporate server he believed had been decommissioned. It had not. He had not finished the work. The room did not move. Not a chair. Not a breath." One of the older directors said, very softly, "Oh God." Preston came halfway up out of his seat. These documents are completely without." Daniel looked at him for the first time. "Mr. Marlowe," he said, "Miss Vale did not lose her company. Someone took it, and he is sitting in the 4th chair from the right." The Halberd Capital screen at the far end of the boardroom went black. Nobody had pressed a button. Their side had disconnected. The chair of the board stood up. He looked at Preston, who was still half out of his chair, his mouth open and producing nothing. He looked at Daniel. He looked at Adrian. "Get corporate counsel," the chair said quietly, "and the state's attorney." Preston sat back down very slowly. His hand, on the arm of the chair, was the only thing in the room that was shaking. For a full minute, no one in the boardroom moved. Preston Marlowe found the bottom of his voice eventually, and tried, very calmly, the way men in expensive suits had been trying for centuries, to make the documents disappear by speaking firmly to them. "This is a fabrication," he said. "A clear fabrication. This individual is not employed by this company, has no security clearance, and any so-called evidence he has produced must have been obtained through—" Daniel did not interrupt him. He simply opened his laptop and turned the screen to face the room. On the screen was an email. Sent from Preston Marlowe's personal address. Received by an executive at Halberd Capital. The subject line read, in plain text, "Magnolia Room schedule confirmed." The body was 3 lines long. It listed a time 7:30 in the evening. It listed a date the night of the 14th. It included the words "Coleman ready" at the bottom. Daniel scrolled. A second email. A third. A fourth. The 4th one was the one that made the older director at the end of the table set his glasses down on the wood and rubbed the bridge of his nose for a long time. In the 4th email, Preston Marlowe had described, with precision and a certain dry pleasure, the moment her card would decline, and the way the room would respond. He had used the phrase, "She will not recover from this socially." Adrian Vale read the screen. She did not look at Preston. She did not look at the directors. She turned her head a single, exact degree, and she looked at Daniel. Daniel met her eyes. He closed the laptop softly. The chair of the board reached for the phone in the center of the table and pressed the button for corporate counsel. Within 20 minutes, 2 attorneys were in the room. Within 40, state financial investigators were on the line. Preston Marlowe sat in his chair through all of it. He did not speak. His face moved through stages, pale, then red, then a flat, unreadable shade of nothing. He did not try to leave. He did not try to lie again. Some men, when they are caught, get loud. Some men go quiet. Preston Marlowe went quiet, and the silence around him grew, and by 4 o'clock that afternoon, he was being escorted from the building by 2 officers in plain clothes, who did not need to put hands on him. He walked out on his own legs. That was the only thing he had left. In the hours after, the larger picture came together piece by piece. Halberd Capital had not invented their strategy at Vale Holdings. They had practiced it. 3 other companies, in 3 other cities, over 5 years, had each lost a chief executive to a sudden and very public crisis, a leaked email, a viral video, a tax filing question that had no real answer, and in each case, a senior internal officer had been quietly aligned with the firm. Each acquisition had completed at a discount of between 15 and 20% of fair market value. The pattern, once laid on a single sheet of paper, was almost embarrassing in how obvious it had been all along to a man who had been looking for it. Daniel had been looking for it for 4 years. He had begun the day after the funeral. The insurance company that had failed his wife had been the 3rd acquisition in the sequence. Its prior authorization system, the one that had produced the clerical error that took 11 days, had been gutted and rebuilt to run faster and cheaper in the months after Halberd had taken it over. The senior advisor who had overseen that rebuild had moved on to Atlanta. His name was on the masthead of a newsletter that had been mailed 3 weeks ago to an old colleague of Daniel's. That colleague had thought Daniel might want to know. He had been right. At the Magnolia Room that evening, Coleman Briggs was fired before the dinner rush. The actual owner of the restaurant, a man who had been a friend of Adrian's father for 30 years, called her personally and apologized for almost 6 minutes without taking a breath. In the small records room on the 6th floor of Vale Holdings, Daniel Mercer closed 3 laptops and walked out into the hallway. Adrian was waiting for him by the elevator. She did not say anything. She reached out and took his hand. He lit her. For a long moment, in the empty hallway, they simply stood there. 6 weeks passed. The Vale Holdings stock recovered. Then it climbed past where it had been before. The story of the restaurant night, once the larger story behind it became clear, ran on national business pages for a week. And then, the way news does, moved on. Preston Marlowe was indicted on charges that would take years to resolve. Halberd Capital announced a leadership change, and a reorganization and several other things companies announce when they are buying themselves time. The Magnolia Room reopened under new management. Adrian Vale invited Daniel and Hazel to a private dinner there on a Saturday in October. There were no cameras. There were 6 people in the dining room. The new chef, a quiet woman who had cooked for Adrian's father in his last years, came out of the kitchen herself with the first course. Hazel wore a soft yellow dress. She carried her sketchbook in a small canvas bag. Halfway through dinner, she pulled out a drawing and slid it across the table to Adrian without ceremony. The drawing was the same composition Hazel had made weeks earlier, a man in a plain shirt, a woman beside him, but the woman was no longer wearing gray. She wore a pale yellow dress. She was standing in a doorway. A robin sat on her shoulder. "What is she doing, sweetheart?" Adrian asked. Her voice had a small, unsteady place in it that nobody at the table was rude enough to notice. "She's coming home," Hazel said. Adrian knelt down beside her chair until her eyes were level with the little girl's. She did not say anything. She pressed her forehead to Hazel's forehead for one heartbeat. Hazel did not move. When Adrian sat back up, she did not look at Daniel right away. He had been watching. He kept watching for 1 second longer than he had to. Then he looked back at his plate. After dinner, Hazel was settled in the back of Renata's car for the ride home, already half asleep, sketchbook tucked under her arm. Daniel and Adrian stood at the small unmarked door at the back of the dining room, the same door he had opened for her 6 weeks before, the night she had not known his name. "I owe you a meal," Adrian said. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I just opened a door." "It was the first thing anyone had done for me in a long time," she said. "That wasn't a calculation." He considered the back alley. The brick wall on the other side was painted with the faint outline of an old advertisement that had not been legible in 50 years. "You were owed better than calculation," he said. She turned to look at him then. She did not reach for him. He did not reach for her. Inside the restaurant, Hazel, half asleep against the window of Renata's car, raised one small hand and waved at the back door without quite opening her eyes. "Daniel waved back." Adrian, after a beat, raised her hand too. The two of them waved at the small girl in the car at exactly the same time and at exactly the same height, and neither of them noticed. The car pulled out of the alley. The door closed quietly behind them. Above the harbor, the early autumn sky was the color of an apricot held up to a lamp, and neither of them spoke for a while.